And I really appreciate it. And thank you for this incredible opportunity. And to everyone that's attending, thank you for giving me your valuable time. It really is a real privilege to be invited to this and to deliver the keynote. And I'm excited. I'm super excited because one thing that I love more than anything is learning and learning from others. And I'm sure that over the next few days, there are going to be so many nuggets and so many ideas and so much collaboration and great networking. And, you know, these type of events really have the potential to change things dramatically and to really create a stronger movement and lots of collaboration amongst all of us. So I'm really excited. And I had a bit of networking before this, and I could just feel the passion and the kindness and just the willingness to engage, which is absolutely amazing. Before I start, I would also like to say thank you to Rise and Lead. I think you guys are doing great work here. And, you know, these events don't happen without a lot of hard work and sweat and tears and energy. So thank you so much for the work that you're doing. And thank you for bringing us together. This is a really, really special event. So for the next 20 minutes or so, I have an opportunity to talk to you a little bit about inclusion and, you know, what that means in the context of diversity and how important it is really to advance diversity and to drive diversity in the workplace. I'm not going to put up a PowerPoint presentation because it's a fairly short presentation of 20 minutes. But if anybody would like some notes, I'm more than happy to share. And the way that I will run through my presentation is really in 3 sections. First, I'm going to do a very, very brief definition of what inclusion and diversity means to me. And the purpose of that is to create just a common understanding and language so that when I talk about inclusion, it's clear what I'm talking about. In the second part, I'm going to provide some insights. And this is really based on my experience and, you know, what I've seen recently. But really, I'm going to go through 5 insights around inclusion and what impact that has in terms of creating diversity and quality of thought in the workplace. And then lastly, I'm going to go through a few very practical tips, because it's all very well to talk about things in theory and to have great ideas, but unless you can implement them when things are practical, they're not as effective. So I'm going to share some ideas and some things that I've done in my own organization that I see are quite effective. So to start with a common language, you know, diversity and inclusion has just become such a hot topic in corporate. It should always have been, but it seems to have got a lot more legs in the last sort of 24 months. And everybody's talking about it and putting targets in place. And, you know, it's really great to see the fast pace right now. It's a little bit late, but we should be grateful that things are moving. And as this happened, I was sitting with my team, and incidentally, my team is a very diverse team in many ways, but from a gender perspective, there's 6 women in the senior leadership team and 4 wonderful men. And they came to me and they said, you know, everyone is talking about diversity and inclusion, but when we talk to our peers in other countries, when we talk to our customers and other stakeholders, everyone's got different views and different ideas, and we think it might be a good idea to develop a common language. And we thought that was a great idea. Let's make sure we're all talking about the same thing. So we got some help. We did some work with the Neuro Leadership Institute, and they broke it down very simply for us. And they said, look, diversity, as you all know, it's all about who has a seat at the table. Inclusion is all about whose voices are heard. And bias, which is an interrelated concept relating to inclusion, really is part of why certain voices are heard more than others. And as we started to unpack this, we said, well, you know, when we're talking about bias, we're talking about how you think. When we talk about inclusion, we talk about how others feel. And bias is all about our processes in our brains, how we process information and make decisions, sometimes taking shortcuts. Whereas inclusion is all about social behaviors and social behaviors in an organization and how that impacts the effectiveness of teams. Now, why is it so important? Why is inclusion such an important thing? Well, many studies have shown, studies around the brain have shown that when we feel excluded as human beings, and this is a common thing across all human beings, when we have a sense of feeling excluded, we have the same chemical reaction in our brain as we do when we are exposed to a physical threat of harm. So what happens in that scenario, when we have a physical threat of harm or when we're feeling excluded, is that the front part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, starts to shut down a little bit. And then what happens is, because it's the area of logic and reason, we have a bit of impairment when it comes to thinking critically and making complex decisions and being creative and collaborative. And the reason for that is because instead of addressing the particular issue, we're managing the social threat of exclusion. And so when we look at that in the context of diversity, it becomes so important, because if we have people, and especially underrepresented groups like women, feeling excluded as they move up through corporate environments and they're feeling under social threat, then it creates a little hump in the road in the ability to think and engage proactively. And what that does mean is that very often you can have a beautifully diverse team, but if there's not an inclusive environment, a lot of your key talent will not be engaged and they will leave, or they will not contribute because they don't feel included. So inclusion is incredibly important in terms of making sure that you really unlock diversity and critical thinking. Now, with that context, I'd like to share a few insights that I've had. The first insight is that inclusion has to be extremely deliberate, but it's also very subtle. I think when you ask many leaders, are you inclusive? The answer will be yes, or at least I try to be. And of course, I feel that way too. But if you're not actively including and very conscious of it, you can be accidentally excluding. And now to give an example of my point, a very practical example of what can happen in an organization around very subtle inclusion versus exclusion. So say hypothetically, I've been in an organization for a number of years. I have a team, and in my team, I have 2 men and 2 women. And the 2 men have been in the organization for more than 10 years, lots of experience, understand the company very well. And the 2 women are relatively new. They've probably been there for 2 or 3 years. And we have a burning platform. There's a critical issue that we have to resolve. So I call the team in because everyone needs to be included. And I say, hey, guys, we've got this huge issue, super urgent, need to come up with a solution. I'd really love to hear everyone's thoughts. And I hand it over for everyone to jump in. So it seems to be quite inclusive. And immediately one of the guys, let's call him John, jumps in and says, well, we had the same issue about 5 years ago. This is what we did. This is how we addressed it. These are the practical things we put in place. And the other guy says, oh, yes, I remember that. I was there at that time. And yeah, we managed to navigate that issue pretty well. And then I say, oh, thanks. That's really great and very helpful. And, just having your experience on that is very useful and really will help us in deciding kind of the route to go. And I like your suggestion on following that approach. And then I turn to the rest of the team and I say these words. Does anyone disagree with John? And everybody's quiet. So I assume, okay, great. We are all good to go. Let's implement that. And let's say that continues, of a few scenarios, similar type of thing where I call the team in, it's a big rush, urgent issue. John steps up, gives us great guidance because he's been there before, and the behavior repeats. Now, in a few months from there, I sit and I think about my team and I think, gosh, when we've had real challenging issues, John stepped up. He's always given us ideas. We've really helped navigate a lot of issues. The other members of the team haven't been so vocal. That's interesting. But, I think John is really ready for more responsibility. Now, the problem with the way that I've dealt with that scenario, besides putting people under a lot of pressure and not giving people time to think through the issue, is that the question that I asked was, does anyone disagree with John? And what I've done by asking that question is I've created an environment where there's a bit of social threat, because really what I'm asking is anybody going to hijack where we are in this conversation? Is anyone going to have a different view which might potentially prevent this issue from being resolved quickly? Or does anyone want to conflict? And as a result of creating that social threat, other members in the team may not give their ideas. If we change that scenario completely, All the facts are the same, except I've called the team in, I've told everyone I want your views, and I get to the point where John gives his ideas, and I say, thanks, John, that's very helpful. It really helped us navigate through this. And instead of turning to the team, I say, does anyone disagree with John? Instead of saying that, I turn to the team and I say, now, can I please have a different perspective? I've asked one question, but it has a totally different social context. And what happens then is that everybody in the team feels, well, my opinion is valued, and therefore I need to give my ideas. And there's an expectation that I give my ideas. And I'm not being asked to conflict with John, I'm being valued. And as a result of that, the ideas start to flow. Now, in a few months, when I look back, I think about the team and I think, gosh, let's say one of the women, Jane, she really gave some really great ideas. She doesn't have as much experience, and John obviously has been here a longer time, but actually her thought is really great. I think she's ready for a bit more responsibility. So my point is that it's very subtle. One question can change the context completely. And so you have to be very aware that if you're not actively including all the time, you could be accidentally excluding. Insight number 1. So moving on to insight number 2. The more diverse your team becomes, the more difficult inclusion becomes. That might sound a bit strange. I often get, I think because I'm a female leader and because I have a very diverse team, people naturally assume that you have a very inclusive environment. And I hope that we do in my company, but it's not necessarily always the case. And give me an example about this is where people are very similar, and we can say we have a group of women in a team. They're all engineers. They all come from, the same town. They all went to a similar university. They all have young families, and they're in a team together. That team, from day one, are able to relate to each other because they have something in common. They're not a very diverse team. Everyone's pretty similar, but they have a sense of common ground. They have a sense of being able to relate to each other. If you have a more diverse team where people have nothing in common, they were completely different, they don't have that immediate sense of I can relate to you. And so you have to work a lot harder to make sure that you create an inclusive environment. So just because you have a diverse team doesn't mean that you have an inclusive environment. And you have to work harder the more diverse teams become to make sure you have a more inclusive environment. Insight number 3 is around over-inclusion. There's a real drive from companies now with, so much focus on diversity and inclusion is we need to include everyone. The problem is that over-inclusion can happen. And what that does is it really is very destructive to your employees because they get pulled into every decision, every meeting. And I'm sure many people from working from home have been completely overwhelmed. So it's really important not to over-include and go to the absolute extreme. One, because you don't want to overburden your employees, but also it's not good for business. Sometimes decisions have to be made quickly, and companies are not run through democracy. So you have to find the optimal balance of where to include and where not to include. Insight number 4. Awareness training and bias training does not result in an inclusive culture. It's part of it, it's important, and if it's done correctly and effectively, it really makes a difference, particularly if it's helping everyone to understand how our brains work and that we might make decisions with unconscious bias. But sometimes awareness training and bias training actually has the opposite effect of creating inclusive environments, because what it does is it creates pockets of in-groups and out-groups and highlights differences so excessively that people don't feel like they belong together. And so one has to be very cautious about that. And as we know, training often happens, everybody attends, everybody loves it. But when you go back to the real world, people jump into the same behavioral patterns. And so you can't just provide training manuals and training, you actually have to drive behavioral change in your organization. And then insight number 5 is around your leadership has to buy into inclusion. In order for your environment to become very inclusive, there has to be a real cultural change. And so the starting point is leadership has to be committed. They have to buy into it. And the behaviors that they display all the time have to be inclusive. Now, that sounds easy, but it's not always that easy. And you need to hold leaders accountable for their behaviors because that's the culture that will develop in the organization. Similarly, or in addition, it doesn't end at leadership. It has to be a complete shift throughout the company. So it's no good that leaders are committed to inclusion and diversity. It has to happen throughout the organization, right to every level of employee. So what do we do practically? Because all of this is great in theory, but what are the things that you can do practically? So here's a few little practical tips. From a leadership perspective, what I find very effective is one, you need to make sure that there is a common language in the organization about diversity and inclusion and what's important and what the company is driving towards. Number two, when you are talking about the goals and the targets, and there's targets around meeting certain predefined goals, but the biggest goal and the most important goal of diversity and inclusion is excellence. It's not about making it a nice place to work. Of course, that's a product of diversity and inclusion, but it's about excellence. It's about getting the best thought processes, unlocking critical thinking, enhancing collaboration and creativity. Then, in terms of behaviors, one thing I found very effective with my team is conducting 360s. As leaders, we often think that we're being inclusive or that we display inclusive behaviors, but that's not necessarily the case. So work with an organization to develop a 360 and allow your leadership team to do one. I did one with my team in the past, and myself included. Everybody needs to be a part of it. And we had to identify one thing that came out of the 360 that we were going to work on or that we weren't aware of. It has to be behavioral change. Number two, you have to create a common identity. When I spoke about, the more diverse it becomes, the more difficult inclusion becomes. The most important thing is to create common goals and common purpose in the organization so that everybody feels part of the in-group, so that everybody feels like they're together and that they're one. And although differences are celebrated and diversity of thought is really important, everybody feels connected in some way to having purpose and goals. The other thing is to support each other. It's really, really important to help people feel included, that they have support and they can support others. And so what a common little thing to do there is in weekly meetings or monthly meetings or even after strategy sessions to ask your team specifically, who are you going to help and with what? And who are you going to ask for help from and with what? And you create an organization where you really have each other's backs and you start to help each other a lot. And then another thing to do is to make sure that you give credit. Credit is really, really important. All of us, everybody loves being told that they've done a good job. Doesn't matter who you are. We all want to be acknowledged for doing things well. It's really important to create that environment and that relatedness and that connection with everybody in the organization to really celebrate and give credit, and not only for hard targets. It's important to give credit for quality of thought. It's important to give credit for learnings and getting to results, but not necessarily hard results, but results of growth and learning. And then, of course, absolutely critical in every single meeting is the question, what do you think? Such a simple question, but often is overlooked. Often in meetings, senior leaders arrive and they just give their views and that's the way to go. But the most important thing is to ask for perspectives and to make that a habit in your organization and almost a rule of every meeting to ask that question, what do you think? And so if we start to create these inclusive environments and we couple it with diversity, we're going to do something really powerful. But we can't only build these beautifully diverse teams without creating these highly inclusive cultures, because we need to make that sure that people arrive at work, they can be their true, authentic selves with no fear, with no social threats, without getting into that threat state that's similar to physical harm, where people feel that they are valued, where people feel that they can contribute and that their voices will truly be heard. Thank you, everyone. I'm really looking forward to the rest of the session. think you're on mute.
Oh my God, sorry.
No
Thank you
problem.
so much. Thank you, Anne. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and knowledge. And I was saying that I particularly like how people were sharing the nuggets, in the chat. And that's one way to learn. And it shows that everybody is engaged. Thank you. We appreciate the notes you're sharing. Keep sharing, keep sharing. And Anne, I'd like to say thank you. Thank you for sharing, and we'll see you in the next
Thank
section.
you. We'll see you then.
Thank you. So now I'm going to introduce the next panel